The napkin was still there, folded neatly beside the untouched glass of water. Their reservation had been scribbled out, a thin black line drawn through their names like they never mattered. I sat at the corner booth, where the light always hit just right, the same place I once laughed with them. The waitress leaned close and said gently, "They're not coming." I looked at her, smiled almost, and said, "I know. I canceled it. Because once, on this very day, they told me, 'Don't eat with us.'" Before we continue, I'd love to know, where are you watching from? Comment below. I live in a small town where the grocery clerk still calls you ma'am, even if you've been shopping in the same aisle for 20 years. There's just one traffic light. It blinks yellow at night, and one main diner where birthdays, funerals, and everything in between tend to happen. Hartley's Grill. Red booths, shaky fans, and a juke machine that hasn't worked since 1993. I'm 74 now. Retired schoolteacher. I taught second grade for 31 years and still can't walk into the pharmacy without someone shouting, "Miss Martha," even if I haven't been Miss anything for nearly 2 decades. I lost my husband, Henry, 18 years ago. He had this way of fixing broken things, lamps, screen doors, even my anxious heart when the kids were little. He passed in his sleep, a quiet end to a noisy life. He never got to meet his youngest granddaughter. I think about that sometimes. Sundays used to be sacred. Hartley's after church, a tradition started by Henry, upheld by me. I'd make a list of who was coming, pack a tin of my banana bread, and walk slowly to the restaurant on Main Street. The kids would meet me there, Thomas with his tie loosened, June in her pressed coat, and Robert, the baby, always late, always grinning. We'd squeeze into the corner booth, the one with the wobbly leg, and pass around stories and ketchup and coleslaw like communion. My hands would ache from the week, but my heart would feel full. It was never fancy, but it was ours. Then things began to shift, nothing loud, just small changes. Thomas started checking his watch more. June answered emails while chewing. Robert would forget to ask about my week. Still, I smiled. I held on. My children are grown now, successful, some might say. Thomas is in real estate, June works for the county, and Robert, well, he always said he wanted to be a musician, but last I heard he was managing a music store 2 towns over. They all have their own lives, their own families. I understand, but understanding doesn't make it hurt less. I still live in the house Henry and I bought in 1978. The siding is faded, the porch creaks, and there's a raccoon that visits the trash bin every Thursday. I get by on Social Security and Henry's pension. The check stretches thinner each year, but I manage. I always have. I fill my days with quiet rituals, watering the plants, folding the same laundry twice, watching the birds fight over the feeder like it matters who wins. I keep old lesson plans in a drawer, though I don't know why. No one asks for them. Sometimes I call the children just to hear their voices. Sometimes they call back. One November, Thomas mentioned a new Sunday tradition, a different restaurant, newer, fancier. "You'd like it," he said. I waited for the invitation, but it never came. June once told me, "We don't want you to feel obligated." As if inclusion was a burden. And Robert, sweet Robert, who used to beg for extra napkins to make paper animals, now forgets my birthday. I tried not to take it personally. People grow. Seasons change. But when I saw them at Hartley's one Sunday, all 3 of them, laughing, sipping iced tea at that corner booth, something inside me folded. They hadn't told me they were coming. They hadn't even mentioned it. I stood across the street, holding a tin of banana bread wrapped in blue cloth, watching them through the window like a stranger. I told myself it was fine. Maybe it was a last-minute plan. Maybe they forgot. So I kept showing up. Each Sunday, I'd walk the 3 blocks with my tin and my hope. I'd sit in the booth. Sometimes I ordered coffee. Sometimes I just sat. I became a regular, not for the food, but for the waiting. I remember one Sunday the waitress, Carol, brought me an extra plate and said, "You expecting company?" I smiled. Always. But weeks passed. Then months. One Sunday, I overheard them making a reservation while I was paying my bill. Carol nodded and jotted it down. And that's when I knew. They still came. They just didn't want me there. They planned around me. And yet, I kept going. Not because I expected them to change, but because some part of me believed that if I stayed consistent, they might remember the mother who once packed their lunches, sat through every recital, and kissed scraped knees like they were diamonds. The hardest part isn't being left out. It's realizing they don't notice you're missing. One day, I lingered after my meal and looked at the old photos on the diner wall, black and white snapshots of birthday parties, wedding proposals, veterans with medals, kids holding balloons. In one corner photo, I saw Henry, young and tall, standing behind me as I blew out candles. The kids were tiny then. I reached out, touched the glass. That's when Carol walked by and said, "They're planning a big meal next Sunday. Should be nice." I nodded, and something in my chest not broke, but settled. Like dust finally realizing it'll never be shaken again. The changes came like slow drips from a faucet that no one bothers to fix. Not loud enough to notice at first, but constant. Just enough to keep the floor damp beneath your feet. It started with the seating. One Sunday, I arrived early as always. I asked Carol if she could seat me at the corner booth, the one where my family always used to gather. She looked at the reservation book and hesitated. "They've already booked that spot, Miss Martha," she said gently. "They?" She nodded once, quiet. I sat at the booth near the kitchen that day, the one where the door swings open every few minutes and you hear every clang and clatter. The one where nobody lingers. I sat there, sipped my coffee, and watched them walk in. They didn't see me. Or maybe they did and chose not to. Either way, it hurt the same. Another Sunday, I baked a small peach cobbler. June used to say mine was better than the bakery's. I wrapped it in wax paper and brought it with me. When they arrived, this time with friends, I walked over slowly and placed it on their table. "I thought you might like a little dessert," I said, smiling as soft as I could. Thomas looked up, confused. June's mouth stiffened. Robert reached for his water glass like he needed something to hold. "We're fine, Mom," June said flatly. "You really didn't have to." So I nodded, picked it up again, and returned to my seat near the kitchen. I didn't cry. I didn't let my hands shake. I just folded the napkin over my lap and waited for the silence to pass. It didn't. That evening, I found the cobbler still in my bag. Untouched. Next came the whispers. I visited June's house one afternoon, a surprise drop by. Something I rarely did. I had a scarf I'd knitted for her daughter, delicate lilac and soft as breath. When I stepped onto the porch, I heard voices from the open window. "She just shows up," June was saying. "Like she doesn't understand we have our own lives." "I know," Thomas replied. "It's like she wants to make us feel guilty." Then laughter. Not cruel, but casual. That's what made it worse. They weren't angry. They were simply done with me. I stood on that porch for a few seconds longer, then turned around. I placed the scarf gently in their mailbox and walked home. That night, I stared at the ceiling and remembered when June had scarlet fever at 8. I'd stayed up all night reading to her, whispering fairy tales into her ear until her fever broke. Small humiliations followed. I once brought my Medicare forms to Robert, hoping he could explain something that confused me. He glanced at them, shook his head, and said, "You should really have someone else handle this stuff, Mom. I'm not good with papers." I told him it was all right. But I remember, years ago, when he called me from college because he couldn't understand how to file his taxes. I walked him through each line, patient slow. Now, apparently, I'm too much. At Thomas's birthday, they rented a private room in the newer restaurant on the other side of town. I wasn't invited. June texted the next day. "Hope you're doing well, Mom. We missed you at dinner." Missed me? I didn't even know there was a dinner. And the worst part, I responded, "It's okay, dear. I'm glad you all had fun." Because that's what you do when you've been trained to make others comfortable, even if it means abandoning your own ache. I began to feel like background noise. Present but unnecessary. Like the ticking of a clock in a room where no one checks the time. At church, people would ask about my children. "They must spoil you rotten," they'd say. I'd smile, nod, change the subject. Even the neighbors noticed. Mrs. Elkins from next door brought over soup one rainy afternoon and lingered longer than usual. "You all right, Martha?" she asked, looking straight into me. "I'm fine," I lied. "Just a little tired." She patted my hand, didn't believe me but didn't push. There's a kind of heartbreak that's too quiet to explain. It doesn't roar. It doesn't shatter. It just seeps. One Sunday, I brought my knitting to the diner. I sat alone, as always, ordered the same grilled cheese and tomato soup, and worked on a pair of socks. The same color as the scarf I'd left in June's mailbox. They came in 30 minutes later. Carol asked if she should tell them I was already there. I shook my head. "Don't bother," I said. "They can see." They walked past me like I was a stranger. June looked down. Robert scratched the back of his neck. Thomas didn't even glance my way. And still, I smiled, because there's a point where the ache becomes expected, And what surprises you isn't the absence of love, but the fact that you ever expected it to begin with. It was Thanksgiving morning when I finally broke. Not in the loud, angry way that you see in movies. No slammed doors, no raised voices. Just a quiet, final unraveling. The kind that happens when the truth no longer asks permission to be seen. I'd been up since dawn, brushing egg wash over the pie crust, just like Henry used to do. I'd pressed the edge with the fork we got in our wedding set, the one with the faded handle that doesn't match the rest. I hummed as I worked, letting the smell of cinnamon and butter wrap around the kitchen like a blanket. This was how I held on, by making things with my hands. I wore my burgundy dress, the one I saved for holidays. I pinned on the small gold brooch Henry gave me for our 25th anniversary, a little rose, delicate and chipped at the corner. My hair wouldn't stay flat, so I tied it back with a ribbon and hoped it looked purposeful. The children had made a reservation. I'd heard June talking to Carol 2 weeks earlier, right after church. They were meeting at Hartley's. I wasn't told directly, but I knew. I always knew. So I packed the pie carefully, wrapped in a dish towel. Walked the 3 blocks through leaves that crackled underfoot. The sky hung low, all quiet gray. I remember thinking how the trees looked like they were holding their breath. When I reached the restaurant, the door was half open, letting warmth and laughter spill onto the sidewalk. I stepped inside, letting my eyes adjust to the soft light. The hostess, a girl I didn't recognize, smiled at me. "Can I help you, ma'am?" I smiled back. "My family has a reservation." She tilted her head, checked the list, then paused. "Oh yes, but they left a note. They asked to be seated without additional guests." I stood still. The pie felt heavier in my hands. I opened my mouth to speak, but no words came. She must have seen something shift in my face, because her smile faltered. I'm sorry. Would you like to wait here until they arrive?" I shook my head. "No, thank you." I turned slowly, every step feeling like it was stitched into something final. When I reached the sidewalk, I sat on the bench just outside, the one with the paint peeling along the edges. I placed the pie next to me. Watched the window. They arrived 10 minutes later, June 1st, holding her daughter's hand. Thomas and Robert followed, deep in conversation, their spouses trailing behind. Not one of them looked toward the window. I watched them settle into the booth. My booth. The one Henry and I always chose because the sun came through just right in the afternoons. They were smiling, laughing, glasses clinking. No empty seat for me. No glance toward the door. No whisper of "Where's Mom?" The ache in my chest didn't come in waves. It came all at once, a steady pressure, as if my ribs were folding inward, trying to protect a heart that had already surrendered. I sat there until the pie cooled completely. Then I walked home alone. I didn't cry that night. I opened the pie, cut a small slice, and sat at the kitchen table. I chewed slowly, not because I wanted to savor it, but because I didn't know what else to do. The ticking of the clock echoed in the silence. I looked at the empty chairs around me. One used to hold Henry, the others filled by children who now dined together without me. That was the moment. The moment I stopped wondering why. Stopped hoping for something that was never returning. I finally understood. I wasn't waiting for them to come back to me. I was waiting for myself to come back to me. I rose from the table, wrapped the remaining pie in foil, and placed it in the fridge. Then I did something I hadn't done in years. I took off the brooch, my little chipped rose, and placed it back in its velvet box. Not out of sadness. Out of clarity. Because I finally saw it for what it was. A memory. Not a promise. That night, I sat in bed with the window cracked open, the cold air brushing my face like a quiet truth. And for the first time in a long while, I let the silence speak louder than their absence. The morning after Thanksgiving was still and gray, like the world was trying to remember how to begin again. The air was cold but not bitter, and the sky hung low with a softness that made you feel small. Not in a bad way, just in a way that reminded you to be quiet. I moved slower that day. Not because I was tired, but because nothing felt urgent anymore. I cleaned the kitchen, wiped the table twice, folded the towel that held the pie dish. There was half a slice left. I didn't eat it. I wrapped it gently, placed it in the freezer. I'm not sure why. Maybe I wanted to keep a piece of that final moment. Maybe I just didn't want to throw it away. It was around noon when I pulled the envelope from the bottom drawer. Yellowed at the corners, the flap already torn from years of being opened and closed. Inside was a letter from Henry. Not a love letter, not exactly. Just a short note he left me one morning after a fight we had about the water bill or the broken steps or something else I can't remember. All it said was, "Even when we don't agree, I still choose you." Every time. It wasn't poetic, but it had stayed with me. That letter became my symbol of what love used to mean. Not grand, not loud, but steady. I sat with it in my lap for a long time, just tracing the lines of his handwriting. It made me think, not of what I'd lost, but of what I had once known how to carry. Later that afternoon, I walked past Hartley's. The window blinds were drawn halfway, the open sign still flipped. I don't know what made me stop. Maybe it was the smell of coffee drifting out, or maybe it was the memory of that waitress telling me, "They're not coming." I stepped inside. The place was quiet, nearly empty. Only 2 other tables were filled, an older couple sipping soup and a young man typing on a laptop. The booths all looked the same, but the room felt different. Or maybe it was me who'd changed. Carol wasn't there. Instead, a young man behind the counter looked up and smiled. "Can I help you, ma'am?" I walked over slowly. "I was wondering," I said softly, "who owns this place now?" He looked surprised. "Mr. Hartley's trying to sell. Said it's too much work now. He's been looking for a buyer for months." A pause. "Do you know him?" he asked. I nodded. "We used to bring our children here. Every Sunday." He smiled kindly. That must have been something. I didn't respond. That night, I took out a notebook, one I usually used for grocery lists or phone numbers that no one ever answered anymore, and I wrote down one sentence. "I'm tired of waiting for them to choose me." Then I wrote another. "Maybe it's time I choose myself." I called Mr. Hartley the next morning. He answered on the second ring, voice familiar and rough around the edges. "Yes," he said. "It's Martha," I said. "Martha Jennings. I heard you're selling the diner." There was a pause on the line, then a low chuckle. "You interested in buying a pile of leaky pipes and memories?" I smiled into the phone. "That depends. Are the memories included in the price?" He didn't laugh this time. Just sighed long and tired. "Come by tomorrow. We'll talk." I did. We sat at the counter, 2 old souls leaning against chipped laminate and shared history. He walked me through the repairs needed, the financials, the things he hadn't told anyone else because no one else had asked with kindness. I told him I didn't want to flip it into something shiny. "I just want to keep it warm," I said. "Keep the booths open for people who need a place to belong." His eyes softened. 2 weeks later, the papers were signed. I didn't tell the children. Not because I wanted to hurt them, but because for the first time, this was about me. This was my choice, not a performance of patience or a hope for reconciliation. I kept everything just as it was, the booths, the salt shakers, even the picture of the founders behind the register. But I added one thing, a small framed quote, right beside the door. "You are welcome here, even if no one else saved you a seat." The first Sunday I opened under my name, only 3 people came in. I served grilled cheese, poured coffee, smiled with quiet steadiness. I didn't sit in the corner booth. I was too busy filling plates and making sure the soup was hot enough. The town started to notice. Word got around. The place with the gentle woman and the quiet music and the sign that made you feel less alone. I didn't do it for recognition. I did it because something inside me had shifted. I was no longer asking to be included. I was building a space where I could belong, and others could too. And somewhere in that quiet resolve, I began to find myself again. Have you ever felt invisible in your own home? Let me know in the comments. I kept the open sign simple, hand-painted on a piece of whitewashed wood, hung gently in the front window with a bit of wire and care. No bright lights, no flashing neon. Just the word itself, open. It meant more to me than business hours. It meant I was no longer waiting for someone to invite me in. The weeks after the purchase were filled with quiet work. I rose early, before the sun warmed the frost off the window panes, and walked to the diner in thick socks and Henry's old coat. The key was heavy in my hand, a real brass key, not a plastic card or a code. Turning it in the door felt like turning something inside myself. Each morning, I lit the coffee pot, wiped the counters, checked the old jukebox even though it hadn't played a note in years. I dusted the picture frames, arranged the sugar packets, and made sure every booth had a clean napkin tucked just so. At first, I didn't change much. I didn't need to. But over time, the place began to reflect something different. Not louder, not newer, just steadier. I brought in a few framed photos from my own home. One of me and Henry on our wedding day, another of the children when they were young and still believed I could fix everything. I placed them near the register, where people paid their bills and sometimes left behind more than loose change. There was a sense of reverence in that small act, like placing a memory on a shelf and saying, "This happened. This mattered." I began keeping a small notebook behind the counter. I didn't write names or complaints. I wrote kindnesses. Lady in booth 3 cried into her coffee. I left her a slice of pie. Boy with the red hoodie gave up his seat for someone's grandfather. Widower named Glenn said his wife used to love this place. Invited him back next week. They were small things. But small things carry a quiet weight. One afternoon, I found an old reservation book in the back cabinet. The one Carol used to write in, the one that held names and times and scribbles in the margins. I thumbed through it, page by page, until I reached November. And there they were, my children's names, written in Carol's handwriting. Right beside it, a note. "Do not seat with Martha. Please keep separate." It felt like being told, "You don't belong," in black ink. Like being erased. I closed the book slowly. I didn't cry. Not anymore. Instead, I took a deep breath, walked to the back door, and placed the book in the bin meant for paper recycling. Not as revenge. Not even as closure. Just as permission. Permission to move forward. The next day, I brought in a guest book. A new one. I placed it at the front with a little pen tied by string. "Leave a thought, a hope, or a memory," the sign read. People began to write. Some left quotes. Some doodled little hearts. One woman wrote, "This was my first meal out since losing my husband. Thank you for the quiet." And just like that, the diner started holding more than just food. It held space. I began cooking more often, not just grilled cheese and soup, but the kind of meals that warmed the bones. Chicken pot pie, cornbread, peach preserves on biscuits, just like my mother used to make. Ellie, a high school girl with gentle eyes and a nervous smile, came in one afternoon asking if we were hiring. Her hands trembled as she spoke, but her voice was steady. "I'm good with dishes," she said. I hired her on the spot. She became my shadow in the kitchen, learning how to fold napkins, balance plates, reheat soup without burning it. One evening, she paused and looked at me. "Why'd you buy this place?" I didn't answer right away. Just stirred the pot a little longer. Then I said, "Because I needed somewhere to go where no one could uninvite me." She didn't ask again. She just nodded like she understood more than her years allowed. Somewhere between early mornings and late closings, something shifted inside me. I stopped dressing for the hope that someone would notice. I started wearing what made me feel soft and whole. Knitted cardigans, my old pearls, the shoes Henry once said made me look like I danced even when I walked. The local librarian started coming in once a week. She brought me used books to read when it was slow. One had a poem about autumn that made me cry quietly during a lunch rush. I kept it by the register. I wasn't lonely. Not the same way. Not the kind that asks, "Why don't they call?" This loneliness had changed shape, into space, into peace. One Sunday morning, I opened the mail slot and found a postcard from Robert. "Hope you're doing well. Just passed Hartley's the other day. Brought back memories. No return address. No love, Rob. Just his name. Just a few words." I didn't reach for the phone. I placed the card in the drawer where I keep the sugar packets and moved on with my day. The reckoning didn't come all at once. It came in these small, deliberate choices. To answer silence with steadiness, to greet absence with warmth not for them, but for myself. Because I finally understood. I could hold sadness in one hand and strength in the other. And still serve pie with both. The memories that cut deepest are the ones that don't raise their voice. They whisper quietly at just the right time. It was a Thursday evening when the power flickered out in the diner. I was alone, wiping down the last booth, the one by the window with the little chip in the tabletop shaped like a heart. The lights went dark, and the only sound was the hum of the refrigerator fading slowly into silence. I lit one of the emergency candles I kept under the register, placed it on the counter, and sat down. Something about the dim light brought it back, a memory I hadn't touched in years. It wasn't about the restaurant. It wasn't even about the children. It was the day I came home from the hospital, nearly 7 years ago. A minor surgery, nothing life-threatening, but enough to leave me groggy and stitched up, full of bruises and silence. I remember the nurse helping me into the wheelchair, her smile kind and gentle. "Someone's coming to pick you up?" she asked. "Yes," I had said. "My daughter." But no one came. Not at first. I waited in that sterile hallway for nearly 2 hours, my discharge papers folded neatly in my lap. Every time the elevator dinged, I straightened in my chair, hopeful, expectant. Every time, it was someone else. Eventually, June walked in. Flustered. On the phone. "Sorry," she mouthed, holding a finger up as she finished her call. I didn't ask why she was late. I just thanked her for coming. She didn't ask if I was in pain. She just helped me into the car and turned up the radio. At home, she placed the bag of prescriptions on the counter and said she had a meeting. "I'll call tomorrow," she said, like a promise made to be forgotten. The door clicked shut, and I stood there, holding the wall with one hand and my dignity with the other. That night, I made myself oatmeal. Sat on the couch with a pillow under my back and watched the shadows change on the ceiling. I called Thomas. No answer. I called Robert. Straight to voicemail. I remember saying out loud, not to anyone, just to the stillness, "I feel like I've disappeared." That night, I wrote my first letter. I didn't send it. I just wrote it, in my softest pen, on the stationery Henry had given me the year before he passed. It said, "Dear ones, I don't need much. Just to be remembered. Just to be seen." I folded it, placed it in a drawer, and never spoke of it again. But that was the first hairline crack. The first betrayal that didn't have a name, only a feeling, like being erased in slow motion. After that, the forgetting came more easily. Birthdays skimmed over with a group text. Mother's Day marked by generic cards with printed signatures. Calls reduced to rushed check-ins, always on their terms, always ending with "gotta run, love you." Love you. I used to believe those words. Now I hear them like punctuation marks, a habit at the end of a sentence. I tried to keep up. Tried to remind myself that children grow, that independence is healthy, that being needed less didn't mean being loved less. But love, real love, doesn't forget your presence just because it's no longer convenient. One winter, I fell on the porch, a patch of black ice I didn't see coming. I didn't break anything, thank God, but I sat there for 20 minutes before the mailman helped me up. He offered to call someone. I told him no, because by then, I'd stopped expecting anyone to come. These memories, they're not loud. They don't scream betrayal. They whisper it. In the form of missed appointments, unanswered texts, blank stares when you remind them of something that once mattered. And the hardest part? You begin to believe the silence is your fault. Maybe I talked too much. Maybe I hovered. Maybe I didn't let go soon enough. But that's what abandonment does. It convinces you to fold yourself smaller and smaller until you can't recognize your own shape. Sitting there in the diner, that night with the candlelight flickering against the glass, I remembered it all. Not to wound myself again, but to see it clearly, to name what had never been named. Because I believe there's strength in looking pain in the eye and saying, "I see you." I am no longer hiding your face beneath polite smiles. I lit a second candle and placed it near the window. And for a moment, it looked like a vigil. Not for death, but for the girl I used to be. The woman who kept making excuses for why her own heart was always left waiting at the door. And in that quiet light, I whispered a simple thing to myself. You are no longer invisible. The wind had begun to shift, that slow tilt between autumn's last breath and winter's first sigh. I had just finished refilling the sugar containers when Ellie came in early for her shift, holding a manila envelope. "This was on the front step," she said, handing it over. There was no return address. Just my name, written in that familiar, neat handwriting I hadn't seen in years, June's. I opened it with care, fingers trembling a little more than usual. Inside was a stack of old photos, the glossy kind we used to keep in albums before phones did all the remembering for us. The first one nearly took the breath from my chest. There they were, my 3 children, seated at the corner booth in Hartley's, dressed in their Sunday best. June's daughter beside her, holding a balloon. A celebration. Cake. Smiles stretched across faces that once belonged to me. Then I saw it. The banner above them, curling slightly at the ends. "Congratulations, June and Mark, rehearsal dinner." My fingers went cold. I flipped the photo over. On the back, scribbled in blue ink, Hartley's Grill, June 12th. That was the week I had called and asked if they were busy. June had said they were keeping it low-key, just family. I remember I'd even offered to drop off a dessert. She'd said, "No need, Mom. We're keeping it simple." They'd sat in the very booth I'd sat in alone, just a week before. They had toasted to her future, in the place built on my past, and never said a word. The rest of the photos showed their table full of laughter, of presence, of togetherness, and not one empty chair. Not one space saved for me. I didn't need a speech. Or flowers. Or even thanks. But to be erased, that was something different. It wasn't forgetting. It was choosing. They hadn't overlooked me. They had intentionally written around me. I pressed the photo between my palms like it was warm bread and waited for the ache to settle. And it did. But not in the way pain used to settle. Not like salt in a wound. It settled like dust on a shelf that would never be disturbed again. That evening, after closing, I walked to the far wall of the diner where old community photos still hung. There were birthdays and anniversary dinners. The kind Hartleys had been known for decades ago. One picture stood out. June's rehearsal dinner. There it was again, the same faces, the same banner. Carol must have framed it long ago, before I took over. Before I knew. I reached up slowly and took it down. There was no anger in my movement. Only a quiet, methodical stillness. Like someone finally removing a splinter that had been buried too deep for too long. I wrapped the photo in a cloth napkin and placed it in the back storage room. Not to destroy it, just to give it a new home. One where it wouldn't look at me every morning like a ghost still waiting for a seat at the table. Later that week, I pulled out the old reservation book from the drawer behind the counter. The same one I'd found weeks ago. I hadn't touched it since I placed it in the bin. But something told me to look again. There it was, just as I remembered, the day of June's rehearsal dinner. Their names circled in red pen. The time, the booth number, and below it, in smaller handwriting, "Please do not mention to Martha." That was the part one hadn't seen before. Please do not mention to Martha. A quiet instruction. A deliberate request. They hadn't just excluded me. They'd built a system around my absence. I closed the book and let it rest on the counter for a moment before sliding it into a brown paper bag. The next morning, I walked 2 blocks to the community center's recycling drop box and placed the bag gently inside. Then I walked home, brewed tea, and sat on my front porch with Henry's old sweater wrapped around my shoulders. I didn't cry. Not because I was strong, but because something deeper had taken root. A knowing. A slow, bitter truth that had finally lost its bite. They were no longer my children in the way they once were. Not the toddlers who ran into my arms after school, not the teens who whispered secrets in the dark, not the grown-ups who promised they'd never drift too far. They were people now, people with choices. And they had chosen this. I had grieved the loss of their nearness for years, thinking it was something that would come back around. Like seasons. Like sleep. But grief, when seen fully, becomes something else. It becomes a boundary. It becomes a door you choose not to open anymore. Not out of anger, but out of self-respect. That night, I took out my own guest book, the new one we kept by the counter, and wrote a note on the last page. You can lose a seat at someone's table by never asking if they were hungry. I signed it with my name. No, Mom. No, Mrs. Jennings. Just Martha. Because from that day on, I wasn't anyone's waiting place. I was a woman who had learned to serve herself what others forgot to offer. I didn't make a big announcement. There was no grand speech, no letter in the mail, no stern confrontation that could be written about later in a therapist's notebook. Just a shift, slow and deliberate, like the changing of a tide you only notice when your feet are no longer touching the shore. I stopped trying to make room for people who had no intention of sitting beside me. It began with small things. I removed their birthdays from the calendar on my fridge. Not out of spite, but because I couldn't keep waking up with a heart full of memory and a phone that never rang. I stopped checking their social media, too. June's curated life, Thomas's business successes, Robert's vague photos of guitar strings and city lights. I stopped pretending I was still part of their backdrop. That Sunday, I unlocked the diner early, let the cold air in for a minute longer than usual. It swept through the booths like a broom made of wind, clearing out everything stale. I wore a new shawl that day. One I'd knitted in the weeks after the rehearsal dinner photo arrived, soft, warm, the color of fog just before sunrise. It wasn't fancy, but it was mine. Not a gift. Not something borrowed. Just something made by my own hands. Ellie noticed right away. You look cozy, she said, her arms full of napkins. I am, I replied, placing the salt shakers on each table. And I intend to stay that way. The first customer was Mr. Dawes, who'd lost his wife 2 years ago and came in every Sunday since, always ordering the same thing. Eggs over medium, no toast. That day, I added a slice of peach pie to his plate, just because. He looked at me with misty eyes and said, "That's kind of you." I smiled. We feed people here, not just stomachs. By noon, the place was gently buzzing. Not crowded, not noisy. Just full in the way that matters. Laughter from a table of teenage girls, a quiet game of chess in the corner between two retirees, the clink of silverware against ceramic. No one noticed that I wasn't watching the door anymore. I used to. Every Sunday, I used to look up each time the bell rang, heart quickening, maybe this time. Maybe one of them would surprise me. Walk in with an apology tucked under their arm like a bouquet. But now, I didn't even glance. I stopped leaving space at my table. Stopped hoping for voices that didn't want to be heard by me. Instead, I sat when I could, cup of tea, biscuit with honey, the newspaper folded at the edges, and listened to the living. A young couple sat in booth 5, arguing gently about whether to paint their nursery green or yellow. An old friend from my teaching days, Mrs. Abernathy, dropped by with a jar of strawberry jam she made from last summer's crop. And for the first time in what felt like years, I laughed from my belly. The kind of laugh that doesn't check first to see if it's allowed. That afternoon, I walked through the back kitchen to the tiny office I'd made my own. I opened the top drawer where I kept my old letters, the ones I used to write but never send. They were all there. Faded ink, folded pages. Words written in desperation and softness and hope. 100 different ways of saying, "Why don't you see me?" I ran my hand over the top letter, then slowly gathered the stack into a ribbon. Tied it once tight. I placed them in a shoebox and labeled it, "Yesterday's Voice." Then I tucked it beneath the shelf where we kept our order pads and extra pens. That night, I did something else new. I set one place for dinner, just me, and lit a small candle beside my plate. I made chicken stew with cornbread, the kind Henry used to love. And when I sat down, I whispered a small blessing. Not for the food, not for the people missing from the table, but for the woman I had become, the one who now chose herself without apology. I didn't need an audience to feel real. I didn't need permission to exist fully. I was still soft, still tender, but I was no longer available for erasure. The next morning, a man came into the diner, early, just as I was setting out the creamers. He looked lost, the kind of lost that lives in the shoulders, not the eyes. "Do you serve breakfast this early?" he asked. "We do," I said, motioning toward the booth by the window. He sat, looked out at the street, and said, "I just needed somewhere to go." I nodded. "Well, you found it." As I brought him a cup of coffee, he asked, "Are you the owner?" "I am," I said simply. He smiled. "You don't seem like the type to run a place like this." I smiled back. "That's the thing about quiet people. We build strong things in silence." He didn't reply, just wrapped his hands around the mug, and I left him with his stillness. And in that moment, I realized I hadn't just reclaimed my place. I'd become someone else's safe booth. Ellie stayed late one Tuesday evening. Not because she was on the schedule, but because I think she sensed I needed someone to linger. The diner had quieted to a hum. A soft radio song played from the little speaker near the register, something with gentle strings and no words, like the kind of music made for looking out windows and remembering things you don't say out loud. She was wiping down the syrup bottles when she noticed the shoebox on the shelf in my office, the one labeled "Yesterday's Voice." "Can I ask what's in there?" she said softly, not turning around. I paused for a moment, then answered, "Letters I never sent." She stopped wiping, turned to face me fully. "To who?" I smiled gently. "People who once made me small." Ellie looked at the box again. She didn't pry, just nodded in that way young people do when they want to honor something, but aren't sure how. A minute passed. Then she walked over, placed the cloth on the counter, and said, "I used to write to my mom." After she left, I'd leave the letters under my pillow, just in case she came back and wanted to know how I was doing. Her voice didn't crack, but her hands curled a little tighter around the edge of the counter. I nodded slowly. "We write what our mouths can't carry." She looked down, then up again. "Do you ever read yours?" "Not much anymore," I said. "They served their purpose." We stood in that hush, 2 generations stitched together by silence and survival. Later that week, I found a folded sheet of paper left on my counter. Ellie had written it. No envelope. Just words. It read, "Thank you for reminding me that warmth doesn't only come from family. Sometimes it comes from strangers who see the parts you've stopped showing." I tucked that note inside my apron pocket and kept it there for days. It was Ellie who suggested we add a small lending shelf to the diner, a book nook for anyone who wanted to borrow or leave something behind. "Doesn't have to be big," she said. "Just enough space for people to share what helped them through." We placed it near the door. A milk crate repainted soft blue with a hand-lettered sign. Take one, leave one, or just sit a while. People began to use it almost immediately. A widow left a novel about grief and hope. A teenager slipped in a poetry book with a note inside. Page 42 helped me sleep. One morning, I found my own letter, one from the shoebox, resting inside, tucked into a mystery novel. It must have fallen out when I had rearranged things. Before I could remove it, an older woman in a red scarf picked up the book. She read the letter first. She didn't look around, didn't ask if it was mine. She just smiled and placed it gently back. That day, something shifted inside me. Maybe those letters weren't just for me anymore. Maybe they were for anyone who needed words to name their ache. I began writing again, not letters to the ones who forgot me, but notes for strangers who hadn't yet forgotten themselves. I left them in coat pockets hung on the diner rack, slipped them between napkin holders, tucked them under pie plates. They weren't long, just simple things. You are not too much. It's okay to miss people who don't miss you back. Your quiet is powerful. Soon, customers began writing their own. Ellie started collecting them in a small jar by the register. We called it the jar of leftover light. That jar filled quickly. A trucker left one that said, "Home isn't always where you were born. Sometimes it's a booth with hot coffee." A mother wrote, "I came in after dropping off my son for his first day of college. I cried into my eggs. Thank you for not asking why." The diner became more than a place to eat. It became a place to exhale. One chilly evening, Ellie handed me a package. "Something came for you," she said. It was from a lawyer's office in town. I thought it might be a mistake, but inside was a crisp envelope, embossed in gold. It was from Henry's old attorney. I opened it slowly. A handwritten note, formal, polite, explaining that a safety deposit box in my name had finally reached the date for opening, as per Henry's instructions. He had left something behind, something I didn't know existed. The next day, I walked into the bank, hands a little unsteady, heart unsure. Inside the box was a letter, folded neatly, yellowed slightly at the edges. It was from Henry, dated 1 month before he passed. It said, "In case the world forgets to tell you, you mattered. You mattered to me, to our children, to the students who learned more from your kindness than your chalkboard. If they forget, remember I didn't. Not even once." At the bottom, wrapped in soft cloth, was the deed to our home. Signed over fully to me. No trust. No co-owner. Just my name. He'd never told me. Not because he didn't want to, but because he trusted I'd find it when I needed it most. I walked home in the cold that evening, fingers wrapped tightly around that folded letter. It was the softest victory I had ever known. Not loud. Not declared. Just mine. It was a Wednesday when Thomas walked through the door. The bell above the frame jingled the way it always did, a sound I'd grown to love again. But this time, it brought with it a strange chill. He looked tired. Not just the kind of tired that comes from too many meetings or not enough sleep, but the kind that settles behind the eyes when something you thought was solid starts to crack. He didn't order, didn't smile, just stood there in his long coat, scanning the room like he wasn't sure where he belonged. I came out from behind the counter slowly, wiping my hands on the apron I'd stitched myself. "Thomas," I said, calm, steady. He cleared his throat. "I heard you canceled our table." "Ah, there it was." I nodded once. "I did." He shifted, caught off guard by the ease in my answer. He started, but didn't finish. The silence between us stretched long and thin. I didn't fill it. Not anymore. "Finally," he said, "we were going to surprise you." I looked at him gently, not with bitterness, not with anger. Just quiet knowing. "No, Thomas," I said. "You were going to perform a kindness, not repair a wound." His eyes dropped to the floor. Behind him, Ellie brought out a pot of coffee, glancing at me briefly before returning to the back. She'd learned, somehow, when to stay close and when to leave room. Thomas asked, "Why buy this place, Mom?" Of all things. I didn't hesitate. "Because it remembered me when you didn't." He didn't respond. I offered him coffee. He declined. And then he left. No slamming door. No shouted words. Just a slow retreat of someone who realized too late that absence has weight, and that sometimes it's the heaviest thing left in a room. 2 days later, June called. I let it go to voicemail. She tried again that evening. And then again the next morning. Her third message was longer. "I didn't realize how far things had gotten, Mom. I'm sorry. I really am." I listened to it while sweeping the front step. The wind had blown in dry leaves from the sidewalk, and I found comfort in brushing them away, one soft stroke at a time. Robert never called. But a letter arrived, postmarked from a city I didn't recognize. No return address. Just my name in his crooked handwriting. Inside was a photo, a candid one of me holding him at his high school graduation. My arms wrapped around his too thin frame, both of us smiling like we still knew how to find each other. On the back, he had written only this: "I wish I had stayed in that moment longer." I placed the photo behind the register, tucked just beside Ellie's first paycheck, which she'd forgotten to pick up and asked me to keep safe. Funny how people ask you to hold on to things when they don't know what to do with them. The days moved forward. Not fast, not dramatic, just steady. The diner remained what it had become, a place of slow healing, of warmth, of pie slices and quiet forgiveness. More people began coming in. A woman with a suitcase, waiting for the bus, cried into her grilled cheese. A man brought his elderly father and asked if he could play a hymn on the old piano in the corner. I said yes. Someone started leaving flowers at the booth by the window. No name, no note. Just daisies freshly clipped in a mason jar. Every week. June eventually came in. Not with an apology. Just with hesitation. She sat at the counter. Ordered coffee. Kept her coat on. We made small talk. Whether Ellie's kindness, how early the leaves were falling this year. She didn't ask to see the back room. Didn't ask why her picture wasn't on the wall anymore. I think she already knew. Before she left, she stood near the book crate, the little lending shelf by the door. She read one of the handwritten notes tucked inside a poetry book. Then she whispered, mostly to herself, "Did you write these?" I looked at her. "I did," I said. She looked like she wanted to cry, or say something brave. Instead, she just nodded, turned, and walked out. And I let her go, because not every apology arrives dressed in words. Sometimes it's in the pausing, the showing up, the not asking for a seat you once refused. That evening, after closing, I lit a candle by the window. A simple tea light, just enough to glow against the dark. It wasn't for them. It wasn't even for me. It was for what had been lost, and what would never be returned, but no longer needed to be. I had spent so many years wanting them to see me again. And yet, in the end, it was me who had learned to see myself. Fully, kindly, without waiting for permission. It was Christmas Eve when they came, not all at once, but like a slow procession of guilt and memory. The kind that moves on uncertain feet. The diner was open that night, just as I had planned. We served warm stew, cornbread, and cinnamon cider. I'd decorated with pine boughs from my backyard and little paper snowflakes Ellie had made in between wiping counters and lighting votives. We didn't play carols, just the soft hum of instrumental piano, enough to let people grieve or smile, whichever the season required. The first to arrive was Thomas. He came alone, holding a small wrapped box. No ribbon, no tag. "Evening," he said, trying to smile. I nodded, then motioned toward a booth by the window. "You're welcome to sit." He looked like he might speak. But then he just lowered himself into the seat, placed the box in front of him like an offering, and waited. Then June arrived, her daughter in tow. The little one looked around, wide-eyed, taking in the warm lights and flickering candles. June spotted me. Paused. "I told her this was Nana's place," she said softly. I knelt slightly, so I could meet my granddaughter's eyes. "Welcome, sweetheart." She smiled, not in confusion, not in fear. Just the simple joy of a child who hasn't yet learned about fractured lines. Robert came last. He stood in the doorway for a long time before crossing the threshold. His hands were shoved deep into his coat pockets. He looked thinner than I remembered, older too, not from years but from something inside. No one said much. They chose a table together, not the corner booth, but one near the fireplace. I didn't go to them right away. I served others, cleared plates, refilled mugs. Then I walked over, gently, with a plate of gingerbread cookies. I placed it in the center of their table. No one reached for one. June looked up. Her voice was quieter than I'd ever heard it. "We wanted to spend today with you. If you'll have us." I looked at each of them, one by one. Then I said the only thing I knew was true. "I'm not angry." They seemed to exhale at once, relieved. "But I'm also not the same." Their faces changed. "I spent a long time waiting for a place at your table," I continued. Hoping, explaining, folding myself small so I'd fit where there was no space. I sat, not with them, but in the chair beside their table. Still close, but not quite inside. This diner is mine now. My choice. My warmth. It's where I remembered I still had a voice, even when yours stopped listening. June looked down. Her daughter quietly reached for a cookie and nibbled. Robert opened his mouth, then closed it again. Whatever he meant to say had gotten lost in his throat. Thomas finally spoke. We didn't realize what we were doing. I know, I said. That was the problem. The silence that followed was different this time. It wasn't heavy with shame. It wasn't filled with apology. It was acknowledgement. They didn't try to fix it. They didn't offer explanations. And that, in itself, was a kind of healing. I stood slowly. You're welcome here. Always. But not as a way to fix the past. Only if you're ready to join the present, where I no longer need to be rescued from the quiet. June reached into her purse and pulled out a small envelope. She handed it to me. Inside was a photo, the same one Robert had sent weeks before. The two of us, my arms around him, graduation cap tilted, faces bright with pride and closeness. Only this time, below the image, she had written, "We see her now. We just hope she still wants to be seen." I folded the photo gently, placed it in my apron pocket. I do, I said. But on my terms. Their daughter looked up. Nana, can I help with the cookies? I smiled. Of course, baby. Come with me. She followed me to the counter, and I gave her a small paper bag and let her choose her favorites. And in that moment, not because of them, but beside them, I felt something loosen. Not the pain. That stays. It just stops asking for center stage. What I felt was choice. And peace. Because reclaiming dignity doesn't require others to agree. It only requires us to stop giving them the power to withhold it. Before they left, Thomas pressed the small wrapped box into my hands. Open it later, he said. I nodded, placed it beneath the counter. They left slowly, each turning back for one last glance. Not dramatic, not regretful. Just human. And when the door finally closed behind them, I stood for a long moment, hands resting on the counter, heart still. Ellie came beside me, not saying a word, just handing me a warm mug of cider. And together, we stood in the soft glow of candles and pine and something else, something like grace. The day after Christmas came with a hush, the kind of quiet that falls not because the world is asleep, but because it's breathing deeply for the first time in a while. I opened the diner just after sunrise. The streets were still, the sky dusted in a soft lavender. A light snow had fallen overnight, layering the sidewalks in a kind of stillness that made every footstep sound sacred. I brewed the coffee slowly, the way I liked it, not because I expected a rush, but because some things deserve their full time. And then I did something I hadn't done since the day I'd bought the place. I walked to the corner booth, the one they used to sit in, the one I had avoided like a wound too fresh to touch, and sat down. Alone. But not lonely. I laid my palms flat on the table and let my eyes trace the familiar cracks in the formica, the soft tear in the seat's vinyl, the place where a child's name had been scratched long ago, faint, but still there. I remembered birthday candles, sticky fingers, Henry's warm laughter, Robert's clumsy jokes, June's quiet pride, Thomas's careful manners. I remembered love. Real love. Before forgetting became routine. Before exclusion dressed itself as oversight. I let the memory pass through me, not as ache, but as honor. And then I stood. I took the wrapped gift Thomas had left, still resting beneath the counter, and brought it back to the booth. I opened it slowly. Inside was a picture frame. Simple, wood hand-sanded. No varnish. Inside the frame, a photo I'd never seen. One of me younger mid-laugh, flower on my cheeks, arms outstretched as I placed a pie on the table. My children were seated around me, mid-laughter themselves. Captured in a moment when they still reached for me first. On the back of the frame, he had written, "This is who we forgot. This is who we're trying to find again. Love always, even when we were blind." I held it to my chest for a moment. Not to draw it in, but to let it go. Because something had shifted in me, and it was no longer waiting. That afternoon, the diner filled slowly. Not with family, but with something just as holy. The book crate by the door was full again. A scarf had been left with a note pinned to it. For someone colder than they show. A regular named Mr. Dawes brought a thermos of tea he'd blended himself and poured a cup for me. "For you," he said. "Because you always pour for everyone else." I hung a new sign beside the register. It read, "There is no shame in beginning again." Ellie had written it in her best cursive, on thick paper edged in gold. That evening, I took down the closed sign and replaced it with another one. Reserved for those reclaiming themselves. And just like that, the diner wasn't just mine anymore. It belonged to every person who'd ever sat at the edge of a celebration and wondered why their seat had gone missing. It belonged to every mother waiting by a phone, every father writing letters in the quiet, every child inside a grown body who still longed to be chosen. I stopped looking back. Not because the past didn't matter, but because I had already carried it far enough. I started walking each morning, just a few blocks, wrapped in my fog-colored shawl, the air crisp and honest. I passed the community center, waved to Mrs. Elkins as she clipped her mailbox closed, sometimes brought a bag of muffins to the librarian, who opened early. I wasn't searching for anything. I was simply present. One Sunday, a little girl handed me a napkin she'd scribbled on with crayon. It said, "You make this place feel like a hug." I folded it carefully, placed it beside Henry's letter in my desk drawer. That evening, I sat by the window with a cup of tea and wrote my own note, not for the jar, not for the shelf. For me. It said, "You did not vanish. You became. You did not harden. You healed." I pinned it above the sink, right where the steam from the dishwater would curl around it like breath. My family still visits sometimes. Quietly. Not always together. Not always for long. But they come. And they stay. Not because I chase them, but because I finally stopped asking them to fill a space they no longer recognized. And in doing so, I made room for something better. Something lasting. Me. This life, simple, rhythmic, soft around the edges, is mine. And in it, I am not a burden. I am not forgotten. I am not waiting at a table for someone to remember I exist. I am seated. Fully. Firmly. At a table I set myself. Now, when I walk through the diner in the early morning light, keys in hand, apron folded neatly under my arm, I no longer carry the ache of yesterday. I carry presence. I carry peace. The tables are set. The pies cool on the sill. The chairs don't creak with emptiness, because I have filled them, with strangers who became companions, with laughter that asked for nothing in return, with my own steady breath. The napkin they once used to cross out my name? I kept it, pressed it into a book like a dried leaf. Not because it hurts, but because it reminds me where I began again. That old booth where they told the hostess I wasn't welcome? It's no longer reserved for regret. Now it holds whoever needs it most. And me? I sit near the window in the mornings with my tea and my shawl, watching the street wake up, watching lives begin, some broken, some brave, all beautiful in their own quiet way. I've learned that you don't need to shout to be heard. You don't need to be invited to belong. You only need to remember your own worth. And choose it. Every day I do. I am not the mother waiting by the phone. I am not the woman standing outside the window. I am not the empty chair. I am the builder of rooms, the keeper of warmth, the quiet reclaiming. If you've ever felt unseen or forgotten, if you've ever stood at the edge of someone else's table, hoping for space, remember this. You were never too much. You were just seated in the wrong room. And one day, when you find the courage to set your own table, you'll discover the most sacred truth. You are always enough. If you've ever felt unseen or forgotten, remember, your worth doesn't depend on their understanding. Share your story in the comments.